Hello and welcome to the Huddle. We're in these conversations for change. We're discussing today the age of strongmen and whether these illiberal democracies, in a sense, are here to stay. With me is former Foreign Secretary Ambassador Nirupama Rao. She served in the US, in China, in Peru, in Sri Lanka, and so many countries where you've seen democracy in action, in a sense. And I do want to ask you, is foreign policy and the way it is being run today being changed by leaders who are seen as strongmen, the leaders who deal directly with other leaders, the leaders who subvert internal systems for foreign policy decisions, and finally leaders who use foreign policy, in a sense, to extend their domestic agendas?
Well, I certainly think that the domestic situation or the trends of opinion within the country become a bellwether for the kind of foreign policy directions that you follow. And secondly, there's much more muscularity and assertiveness about how policy is executed today, especially foreign policy, because you are trying to send a signal back to the home audience that you mean business, that you stand for strength and assertiveness and national pride above all. And that then becomes the signature element in the kind of policy you follow. And thirdly, you like to convey the impression that you live in a tough neighborhood and that you are constantly beleaguered by the foreigner, by the immigrant, by the outsider, and by somebody who threatens your security, because essentially human beings want security. Even more than freedom, perhaps. They want security. And I think you are able to tap into many of the strongmen leaders that you know today are able to find that deep vein, as it were, within the social body politic, and they use it to full advantage.
All right, now amongst those strongmen are certainly Prime Minister Modi, the leader of the world's largest democracy, President Trump, the leader of the world's oldest democracy, and they're coming together in India. Do you see a joint political rally of the kind we've seen in Houston, of the kind we're seeing in Ahmedabad, in fact, as something that is changing foreign policy? Is it actually having an impact on the diplomacy of the two countries as well?
Well, I think the pan-optics, if I may say, of foreign policy have come very much to dominate the projection of such policy. And therefore, in the case of Mr. Trump and Mr. Modi meeting, the element of spectacle that is introduced into the domain, as it were, has come very much to define what these visits and these summits, and whether they're informal or formal, are about. You saw that in Houston last year. You saw that even before in Madison Square Garden. And now, of course, in the Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel Stadium in Motera, in Ahmedabad. It's going to be a big show, as it were, and there's no business, as they say, like show business. And I think the strong leader, the muscular leader, the assertive leader, the populist leader reaps full advantage from that.
All right, but in a sense, is our foreign policy objectives actually taken forward? Some have suggested that summit-level diplomacy, and we see it with, say, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping as well, that it doesn't actually further the foreign policy objectives. Give us a sense of where you think the India-US relationship is going after this clear meeting of minds, in a sense, between Mr. Modi and Mr. Trump.
I think the India-US relationship is in a fairly good state of health. And therefore, despite the spectacle, or even if there were no spectacle, you would have to concede that the relationship has been on a steadily upward directed trajectory over the last few years. And the indices of health, if you were to check, seem to be, I think, fairly satisfactory. And even apart from the stadium, spectacle that you're going to see, behind the scenes, obviously, the bureaucrats on both sides, and I think there are professional elements in both countries that are focused on the nuts and bolts of the relationship and where it needs attention and where things are proceeding satisfactorily. Of course, on trade, most of the consensus opinion that has come out is that it's very unlikely that you're going to see a big trade deal, and maybe that is reserved for the next few months. You have the US election coming up. This is a very big issue domestically within the United States, not just the India trade account, but essentially the whole issue of imports and exports and what happens to American jobs, and especially in what they call flyover countries.
So in a sense, protectionism is more important.
I think it's happening all over the world, and I think the principles on which the WTO was founded. I think very much these are endangered species today, multilateral trade organizations. Everybody is looking for bilateral trade pacts. Everybody is talking about protectionism. It's like Back to the Future.
Right. So finally,
but my continue in areas like defense, and especially defense and strategic, the strategic relationship between India and the United States is very much in focus. The whole issue of the Indo-Pacific, how do you sharpen the definition of what common interests are? All that, I'm sure, will receive attention. And the communique or the joint statement at the end of the visit, I'm sure, if you read the contents of it, there will be focus on these issues.
Finally, back to the central theme of this age of strongmen. If you look around the world, more than 33 such countries where we've seen these leaders emerge in the last, say, 30 years, mostly in the last 15 years. Do you see this as a trend for the century, or do you think strongmen, as a sense, are part of a political cycle and perhaps will not last out as long?
Well, with no pun intended, frailty thy name is democracy, I would say today. Because democracies, in many ways, are being redefined by the emergence of strong men, or strong leaders, as they would like to call themselves. And I think no conditions apply any longer. You have to be prepared for uncertainty. And gradually, I think, unless the constitutional institutions remain strong and resilient and able to mount a challenge against creeping, some people call it authoritarianism, I think we're in the Chinese definition of the word, interesting times.
Well, certainly, and it will be to those democracies that people will turn to see whether they're able to push back, in a sense. Nirupama Rao, thanks so much for joining us here at the Huddle. Of course, the conversations continue online, www.thehindu.com. From the team here, thanks for watching.